Hey there, and welcome to Unit 10, where we will be discussing sheep feeding. Recommended reading, of course, I'm sure that you've all accomplished taking care of reading Chapter 10 in your text. Really quickly, we'll look at the feeding, the objectives here and talk about feeding sheep. And again, very similar to the other species as we begin to wrap up the course here, talk about the life cycle feeding program for sheep, talk about nutrient needs and requirements and additive options. And then briefly, right at the end, we'll hit on diseases and disorders metabolically that can come into play. So let's get to our content here. First off and foremost, of course, like with all of the species, feed is the largest cost of production by far. It's in that 60% range, depending on what you are doing from a feeding perspective and how much labor you want to put in. But it's the largest cost, easy. So keys is optimum production. Find that spot in there where we can really make a lot of good quality lamb at a very efficient rate, in a very economical rate, and minimize the metabolic and other challenges that come along with raising sheep. So let's get to how we do that. So the first segment here in this two-part series is going to focus on the breeding flock and the ewes. Of course, their role is, of course, to raise the lambs, and then if you have a market for wool, which is primarily non-existent anymore unless you've got a niche market, then wool production is pretty critical there as well. But the primary revenue generation is, of course, off of those market lambs. Just like with all of the species, feed affects genetic expression, and the quality and the efficiency and the accuracy with which we put together effective feeding programs is going to clearly impact genetic expression. And I get a lot of eyebrow raises on this one, comes straight out of your text, and there's actually quite a bit of data that supports it. But versus all other meat animal species that we've discussed in the class, sheep are the most profitable. Part of that is because it really takes very little from a cost investment to get them going. And if you have a good marketplace, you can realize a pretty good return on your investment. So they are the most profitable meat animal species. So something to think about if you're looking for an opportunity. All right. So from a lambing perspective, we're going to dive in and think about two different lambing periods, kind of very similar to beef cattle with that fall calving or spring calving, kind of very similar type approach and philosophy, early lambing versus late lambing. And the influences on that, especially when we talk about that early lambing period, is lamb price is historically a bit higher. If you have lambs that are ready for market from that early lambing period, you probably capture a little bit higher market price. It's not super substantial, but it is a little bit greater opportunity. There's sometimes more available labor, and that's important because you're going to probably need more intensive management and more intensive hand feeding for the early lambs because simply pasture is not available quite yet, especially here in southern Illinois. Stocking rate and facilities, you would have to kind of focus on that. Now, please don't get mistaken here. We don't need fancy facilities. We don't need to build specific barns, probably. Something just doable that keeps them out of the wind, the cold, and the mud will probably get the job done. They don't need anything really except a dry place to get feed and water and get themselves in a little bit of shelter. So you don't necessarily need some kind of fancy facility. Something very basic will get the job done. Challenges, of course, there's not many here to list. And really kind of a benefit of the early lambing is there's less and also less severe parasite risk. It's just simply too cold for a lot of those parasites to be coming out of dormancy, and so you have less opportunity for them to put pressure on what's going on. Of course, from a feeding perspective, as we talk at that very early turn of the calendar, you're going to be feeding a lot higher grain and probably managing your forage a lot differently from a feeding perspective, whether you're feeding hay or even corn silage. You'll find that from time to time in sheep rations because there's minimal or no pasture available. So it gives you the opportunity to have a little bit more control over the diet. You can kind of put together a more specific, specialized ration plan. You have the opportunity to drop in additives like ionophores or a medication or to help your ewes and your lambs get rolling and be successful. So let's contrast that with the late lambing period, which would be lambs born March and April. Here, of course, you have the opportunity because now early season cool grasses are coming on. You have the ability to really focus your ration on mostly grass, providing the majority of the nutrient content. It's going to be very lush, so it's going to be pretty high in protein and fairly high in usable carbohydrates. So that will really minimize the amount of grain supplementation that you will need and makes, of course, the ration quite a bit cheaper. Lambs actually will do a pretty good job of reaching market weight with very little concentrate if you've got great quality pasture. The downside, of course, is you have less ration control. So if you want to get an ionophore in them, it's quite a bit harder. And then the other downside is lamb price tends to be historically a bit lower there versus that early lamb period. Facilities, of course, here less critical. Not that we don't need any relief from the wind or the mud or the rain, but it's less critical because they're going to spend and need to spend more time on pasture in order to make this system work. Your challenge is then kind of, again, compare and contrast that early lamb period. It's getting warm enough at this point in time, March and April and on through when those lambs will finish, that parasite risk now becomes much higher, whether we're talking gastrointestinal parasites, respiratory parasites, or simply flies. The parasite challenges become much, much greater. And of course, have to just reinforce one more time, if you're going to late lamb, pasture takes the primary role of the ration, so it has to be critically done well. And whenever I say done well, I'm really referring to a good blend of grasses. So rye that hit that very early season, orchard grass, fescues, things of that nature, kind of a good blend of those different things, and then sprinkling in a little bit of legume here and there, whether it's a tad bit of clover or a wee bit of alfalfa or bird's foot trefoil, something that provides just a smidge of protein punch will get the job done. And then really primarily when you hear me talk about pasture quality, it's as much as anything minimizing weed infiltration because those broadleaves that can come in there and compete can really drive your pasture quality down. Therefore, your success rates and efficiency will go down. So let's talk the breeding flock for a little bit here. Feeding those ewes and lambs and kind of a very rudimentary feeding budget that we can put together. About 4 bushels of grain. And if you don't know what 4 bushels look like picture 4 or 5 gallon buckets full of grain. That'll pretty well do it. And about 800 pounds of hay will get the job done. It's very, very basic. If you've got 5 to 6 months of good pasture, you can substitute some of that hay out. If you got crappy hay, you're going to need more grain. Very simple. At this point in the course, you should have a fairly good idea of what good rations need to look like from a quality perspective. Maintaining mature ewes, that 3 to 8 age range, really focus on body condition score. We've talked about that a number of times. It's a wee bit harder when we talk about ewes with the wool coverage, but you'll get the hang of just kind of examining body condition score. And so, of course, if they're lactating ewes, we want to minimize their body weight loss. So again, great pasture will help do that. Feeding for breeding, kind of an interesting, different little concept here with sheep. Whenever they're primarily on pasture, that because of the differences in proteins, carbohydrates, and especially minerals, we can get some influences on hormone production in ewes. And so it's good practice to pull them off of pasture for a couple weeks prior to the breeding season, get more control over the ration. They will then ovulate much more fertile eggs, and you'll have higher success rates reproductively. So it's a little bit different management approach you need to take with ewes. Does a great job. But again, similar to beef cattle, we want a small, tight breeding window in order to get those lambs all coming about the same time. The breeding flock, again, gestation time is about 150 days, give or take a little bit. So the first 3.5 months, we want to maintain body condition score with great, good quality pasture. That will pretty well do the job little bit of mineral supplementation perhaps will get the job done. Once we reach lambing, then you need to increase the crude protein content, of course support them with more carbohydrates, minerals, and vitamins in order to help them get through that lambing time period and start to support some offspring. So what are the risks if you have poor quality management? Well, lambing paralysis and pregnancy disease, we'll hit those at the end of the slide deck. Weak lambs, which of course are at much greater risk for mortality and morbidity problems. Low milk production, which will decrease your lambing weaning rate, and of course decrease wool clip if that happens to be important. So got to do a good job through this gestational and transition period. The lactating ewe then, for the breeding flock, nutritional requirements very similar to all other lactating mammals, 2 to 3 times that of maintenance. And so if we have twins, that's a 20 to 40% more milk production requirement, so we need to adjust accordingly. You need to be up at that 3x of maintenance, maybe even 4x, depending on what they're doing. Ewes at peak milk are going to make somewhere around 3 to 6 pounds a day, and that occurs at about 8+ week. They have an 8-week lactation length, and they peak at about week 2 or 3. Unique to ewes, they should come on at lambing. After lambing, they should come on to full feed by about day 3. But you don't want to force them to eat right away. If they go off a feed, it's pretty normal. Forcing them to eat or pressuring them to eat will actually cause more issues that you want to be aware of. They'll get into overeating and things of that nature. So just kind of let them come up onto feed naturally, and they should be okay. We wouldn't do that with virtually anybody else, but unique to sheep. So increasing feeding times reduces acidosis risk. So if we're supplementing them with a decent amount of grain, then you have to be split that out a little bit, and that will decrease your acidosis risk factors. All right, let's take a break. That wraps up the first segment. You can conclude this with the second segment following.